Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Mechanic's Mask. Kenneth Bauer wiped the grease from his hands with a red shop rag, the familiar smell of motor oil and metal filings filling his nostrils. Bauer's Auto Repair sat on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Colorado, a deliberately chosen location that kept him away from the prying eyes of suburbia. To his customers, he was just another small-town mechanic who could fix anything with wheels. They had no idea that the man replacing their brake pads had once led covert operations in the mountains of Afghanistan. The bell above the shop door chimed as Angela Hansenbauer walked in, her designer heels clicking against the concrete floor. Even after 8 years of marriage, she still carried herself like the real estate agent she was, polished, professional, and increasingly distant. Kenneth noticed how she avoided looking directly at the greasy coveralls he wore, as if his honest work somehow diminished her. "Kenneth, I'm showing a property to a client tonight. I'll be home late." Her voice carried that practiced tone she used with difficult sellers. "Don't wait up." He nodded, watching her reflection in the chrome bumper of the Mustang he was working on. Angela had been showing properties a lot lately, always to mysterious clients who seemed to require evening appointments. Kenneth's trained eye caught the subtle tells, the way she touched her neck when lying, the slight pause before delivering rehearsed lines, the new perfume that wasn't the one he'd bought her for their anniversary. "Who's the client?" Kenneth asked casually, not looking up from the engine. "Stephen Hathaway. He's looking for commercial space downtown." The name rolled off her tongue too easily, like she'd practiced saying it. Kenneth filed the name away in the mental catalog that had kept him alive through 3 tours overseas. Stephen Hathaway. He made a note to remember it. After Angela left, Kenneth locked up the shop and walked to his truck. The transition from mechanic to hunter was seamless, a skill he'd honed in places where the wrong move meant death. Tonight, he would begin surveillance. The restaurant where Angela claimed to be meeting her client was a small Italian place called Marcelli's, known for intimate lighting and secluded booths. Kenneth positioned himself across the street in his truck, using the same patience that had made him an exceptional sniper. He didn't have to wait long. Angela arrived first, but she wasn't dressed for a business meeting. The black dress she wore was one Kenneth had never seen, cut low and hugging curves she'd been hiding under conservative real estate attire. 20 minutes later, a man arrived, tall, dark-haired, wearing an expensive suit that screamed corporate money. Stephen Hathaway, no doubt. Kenneth watched through military-grade binoculars as the man kissed his wife. Not a greeting between business associates, but the lingering kiss of lovers who'd been apart too long. Angela's hand found the man's chest, her fingers tracing patterns that Kenneth recognized as intimate gestures she'd once reserved for him. The betrayal should have hurt. Instead, Kenneth felt the cold calculation that had made him deadly in combat. His wife had chosen to play a dangerous game, and she had no idea she was playing against someone who'd perfected the art of war. Kenneth started the truck and drove home to their suburban house on Maple Street. The white picket fence and manicured lawn were Angela's choices, part of the respectable life she'd wanted after his discharge. Inside, he went to the basement workshop where he kept his hobby equipment, tools that had nothing to do with automotive repair. Hidden behind a false wall were items from his military days, surveillance equipment, tactical gear, weapons that weren't registered anywhere. Kenneth had never truly left the battlefield. He'd simply changed theaters of operation. He powered up the computer system he'd built for security research and began running background checks on Stephen Hathaway. The man's digital footprint revealed interesting details. Divorce attorney specializing in high-asset cases, multiple properties, a history of relationships with married women. Angela wasn't his first conquest, just his latest. As Kenneth compiled his intelligence, a plan began forming. He'd learned in the service that the best operations were those where the enemy eliminated themselves through their own choices. Angela and Stephen thought they were playing a simple game of adultery. Kenneth would show them what real strategy looked like. The basement workshop had another secret, a hidden room behind the water heater where Kenneth kept his most sensitive equipment. Tonight, he retrieved audio surveillance devices, micro cameras, and GPS trackers that would turn his own home into an intelligence gathering station. By dawn, Kenneth had planted monitoring devices throughout the house, focusing on Angela's private spaces. Her home office, their bedroom, even her car would now report to him. The mechanic's mask would remain in place, but underneath, the commander was taking control of the battlefield. Kenneth made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at the peaceful suburban morning. Neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes to school, the postman making his rounds. None of them knew that a war had just begun, and that by the time it ended, some people who were breathing this morning would no longer be drawing breath. Angela came home at 2 a.m., slipping into bed with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to deception. Kenneth pretended to sleep, listening to her breathing settle into the rhythm of someone whose conscience carried no burden. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. Chapter 2. Patterns of Deception. 3 weeks of surveillance revealed the intricate web Angela and Stephen had woven. Kenneth discovered their pattern. Tuesday and Thursday client meetings, weekend property viewings, and late-night phone calls Angela thought she was having in private. The audio devices captured everything: intimate conversations, future plans, and most importantly, their growing carelessness. Kenneth maintained his routine at the shop, but his real work happened after hours. Using skills learned in military intelligence, he mapped their relationship timeline, identified their meeting locations, and documented their communications. What he discovered went far beyond simple adultery. Stephen Hathaway wasn't just Angela's lover. He was her financial advisor in a scheme to drain Kenneth's assets. The auto shop, their house, Kenneth's military pension, even his disability compensation were all targets in their long-term plan. They intended to force a divorce where Angela would claim emotional abuse, taking half of everything while maintaining the sympathy of the community. The recordings from Angela's home office revealed the depth of their planning. "He's too trusting," Angela had said during one late-night call. "Kenneth thinks I'm this innocent real estate agent. He has no idea how much I've learned about hiding assets." Stephen's response chilled Kenneth to the bone. "Once we're married, we'll relocate to Costa Rica. No extradition, and your husband's military honor will prevent him from coming after us." Men like him follow rules. They were right about one thing: Kenneth followed rules. Military rules. Rules of engagement that applied when dealing with enemy combatants who threatened everything he'd built. Kenneth's investigation expanded to include Stephen's law practice. Using social engineering techniques, he posed as a potential client and gathered intelligence on Stephen's operation. The man was running a sophisticated marriage destruction business, identifying wealthy spouses, seducing their partners, then manipulating divorce proceedings to maximize their take. Angela wasn't Stephen's first victim, and she wouldn't be his last. Kenneth found evidence of at least 4 previous cases where Stephen had orchestrated similar schemes. 2 of those previous victims had died under suspicious circumstances after the divorces were finalized, apparent suicides that removed loose ends and freed up money for Stephen and his accomplices. The pattern was clear: seduce, steal, eliminate. Angela thought she was Stephen's partner, but Kenneth recognized her true role. She was another mark, useful for accessing Kenneth's assets, but ultimately disposable once Stephen had what he needed. Kenneth's training had taught him to always gather intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. What he discovered about Stephen's resources was troubling. The man had connections to professional criminals, cleaners who specialized in making problems disappear. Kenneth found encrypted communications referencing the Pine Ridge problem and payments to individuals with military-style call signs. It became clear that Stephen and Angela weren't just planning to steal from Kenneth. They were planning to eliminate him entirely. The suicides of Stephen's previous marks hadn't been suicides at all. They'd been executions disguised as mental health crises. Kenneth's basement workshop became a war room. Maps of the area, photographs of all involved parties, communication intercepts, and tactical assessments covered every surface. He was no longer just dealing with infidelity. He was facing a conspiracy that threatened his life. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Kenneth had followed Angela to what he thought was another rendezvous with Stephen, but instead of meeting at their usual locations, she drove to a warehouse district outside town. Hidden in the shadows, Kenneth watched as Angela met not just with Stephen, but with 4 other men. Through his scope, Kenneth recognized the type immediately. Military contractors, the kind of men who sold their skills to the highest bidder. They moved with the disciplined precision of former special forces, and their discussion with Angela and Stephen was clearly operational in nature. Kenneth couldn't hear the conversation from his position, but he could read body language and tactical positioning. This was a planning session for an operation. Maps were spread on a table, photographs were passed around, and money changed hands. One of the contractors held up a photo that Kenneth recognized. It was his house on Maple Street. The reality hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to frame him or steal from him. They were planning to have him killed. Angela would play the grieving widow, inheriting everything legally. Stephen would console her through her loss, and together they'd disappear with Kenneth's life's work. Kenneth's phone vibrated with a text message from Angela. Working late again. Client emergency. Love you. The casual lie, sent while she stood 50 yards away planning his murder, crystallized something cold and final in Kenneth's chest. This wasn't just betrayal, it was warfare. And in war, Kenneth played by different rules than the ones Stephen assumed he'd follow. Kenneth made his decision in that warehouse parking lot. He wouldn't wait for them to act. He wouldn't try to reason with them or appeal to whatever humanity Angela might have left. He would do what he'd been trained to do. Neutralize the threat with extreme prejudice. The drive home was spent in tactical planning mode. Kenneth mentally cataloged his resources, considered various scenarios, and began formulating a strategy that would eliminate all threats while maintaining his operational security. By the time he pulled into his garage, the plan was taking shape. Angela came home at midnight, slipping into bed with her usual stealth. Kenneth lay in the darkness, listening to her breathe, knowing that tomorrow he would begin the kind of operation that had made him legendary in certain military circles. But this time, the battlefield was his own home, and the enemy had already made the fatal mistake of underestimating him. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Preparation. Kenneth's transformation from betrayed husband to tactical operative happened gradually over the following weeks. He maintained his cover as the trusting mechanic while systematically preparing for war. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required meticulous planning, and this mission would be no different. The first phase involved intelligence gathering on the contractors Angela and Stephen had hired. Using skills he developed in counterterrorism, Kenneth identified each man through facial recognition software and cross-referenced their identities with databases he still had access to through military contacts. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The team consisted of former Delta Force operatives who'd gone private after questionable discharges. Their leader was a man named Gordon Pierce, known in certain circles as the Cleaner. Pierce specialized in assassination disguised as home invasions, random violence that left no trail back to whoever paid for the hit. Kenneth's surveillance revealed their method of operation. Surveillance the target's routine, identify the optimal time for attack, breach the home during vulnerable hours, eliminate the target, and stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. Simple, effective, and virtually untraceable when executed properly. What Pierce and his team didn't know was that they were planning to attack someone who'd spent years hunting men exactly like them in much more dangerous environments. Kenneth began turning his suburban home into a tactical maze designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. The modifications were subtle but lethal. Reinforced entry points that would force intruders to use specific routes. Strategically placed mirrors that gave Kenneth sight lines throughout the house. Weapons caches hidden in seemingly innocent locations. And emergency escape routes built into the basement workshop. To any casual observer, it looked like standard home security improvements. To someone with Kenneth's background, it was a fortress designed for close-quarters combat. Kenneth's preparation extended beyond physical modifications. He began altering his routine to create the appearance of vulnerability while actually strengthening his defensive position. He started taking his evening walks at precisely 9 p.m., during which he would actually position himself in overwatch positions around the neighborhood. His early bedtime routine actually involved positioning himself in the basement armory, monitoring the surveillance feeds he'd installed throughout the house. The psychological preparation was equally important. Kenneth spent hours in meditation, centering himself for what was coming. He'd killed before, but always under orders, always with the moral clarity of serving his country. This would be different, personal, intimate, and entirely outside the legal structure that had previously governed his actions. Kenneth also began making subtle changes to his legal and financial situation. He created new bank accounts under identity protocols he'd learned in covert operations, established safe deposit boxes with emergency funds and documentation, and prepared multiple exit strategies in case the operation went wrong. Everything had to be ready for a rapid disappearance if necessary. The most crucial preparation involved manipulating Angela and Stephen's timeline. Through careful psychological pressure, mentioning home security concerns, discussing neighborhood crime, expressing worry about working late alone, Kenneth encouraged them to accelerate their plans. He needed them to act while he was ready, not when they chose. The breakthrough came when Kenneth intercepted a communication between Pierce's team and Stephen. They'd set the date, Halloween night. The symbolism wasn't lost on Kenneth. They planned to make his death part of the season's horror. What they didn't realize was that they'd chosen to attack a man who'd become very comfortable with darkness. Kenneth spent the final week before Halloween in intensive preparation. He cleaned and tested every weapon in his arsenal, memorized the tactical layout of his modified home, and ran through combat scenarios until his responses became automatic. He also made peace with what he was about to become. No longer a soldier following orders, but a man dispensing justice according to his own code. 3 days before Halloween, Kenneth made his final preparations. He arranged for a business trip that would give him an alibi for being away during the attack, except he wouldn't actually leave town. Instead, he'd be waiting in his basement command center, ready to spring the trap he'd spent months preparing. On Halloween morning, Kenneth kissed Angela goodbye for what he knew would be the last time. She responded with the same casual affection she'd been showing him for months, completely unaware that her husband had discovered her plans and prepared a counter-operation that would end with her death. Kenneth spent that final day at the shop, maintaining his routine while internally running through the tactical checklist one last time. Everything was ready. Weapons positioned, surveillance operational, escape routes prepared, and contingency plans in place for every possible scenario. As evening approached, Kenneth closed the shop and drove home, knowing that before dawn, Fermin would be dead, and his marriage would end in blood. He felt no emotion about what was coming, only the cold certainty of a professional completing a mission. The mechanic's mask would come off tonight, and Pine Ridge would discover what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening a man who'd earned his reputation in the world's most dangerous places. Halloween was about to become very real for the people who thought Kenneth Bauer was just another mark to be eliminated. Chapter 4. The Watchers Watched. October 30th passed in a haze of false normalcy. Kenneth went through his usual routine at the shop, but every action was performed with the hyper-awareness of a soldier preparing for battle. He could feel Pierce's team conducting surveillance, their presence like static electricity in the air around his neighborhood. Kenneth had identified their observation posts through his own counter-surveillance operations. A panel van parked 3 blocks away with rotating occupants, a construction worker who'd been reading the same newspaper for 3 days, and a jogger whose route always included passing Kenneth's house during shift changes. They were professionals, but Kenneth had spent years hunting professionals in environments where detection meant death. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Pierce's team watched Kenneth, Kenneth was watching them. His own surveillance network had cataloged their routines, identified their communication patterns, and mapped their operational procedures. They thought they were the hunters, but Kenneth had flipped the script without them realizing it. Angela's behavior reached new levels of deception during these final hours. She made elaborate plans for Halloween night, a girls' night out with colleagues from her real estate office. The lie was carefully constructed with multiple witnesses and a paper trail, designed to give her an airtight alibi for Kenneth's planned murder. She even bought new clothes for the occasion, playing the part of the excited wife looking forward to a rare night away from home. Stephen's involvement became more obvious as the deadline approached. He called the house multiple times, ostensibly to discuss property listings with Angela, but Kenneth's audio surveillance revealed the coded language they used to coordinate the final details. Time confirmations disguised as appointment scheduling, escape route discussions masked as driving directions, and payment confirmations hidden in conversations about commission structures. Kenneth's final day of preparation involved a delicate psychological operation designed to ensure Angela and Stephen would proceed as planned. He expressed concern about recent break-ins in neighboring areas, mentioned his planned early bedtime due to feeling under the weather, and even suggested that Angela should definitely go out with her friend to take her mind off his security paranoia. Each suggestion was calculated to reinforce their existing plan while appearing to come from Kenneth's own anxiety. Angela responded perfectly, offering to cancel her evening to keep him company, while secretly relieved that he was practically giving her permission to be elsewhere during his assassination. The afternoon brought a crucial piece of intelligence when Kenneth intercepted a final communication between Pierce and Stephen. The attack was confirmed for 11 p.m., after Kenneth's usual bedtime, but early enough to catch him in his most vulnerable state. Pierce's team would breach through the back door while Kenneth slept, eliminate him quickly, and stage a burglary scene before disappearing into the night. What they didn't know was that Kenneth's bedroom would be empty and their target would be positioned in the basement with full surveillance coverage of their operation. The hunters would become the hunted the moment they crossed his threshold. Kenneth spent the evening creating the perfect illusion of normal domestic life. He cooked dinner for Angela, watched television with her on the couch, and even helped her choose jewelry for her night out. To any observer, including Pierce's surveillance team, it looked like a typical suburban evening before the wife left for her social engagement. At 9 p.m., Angela kissed Kenneth goodbye with what he recognized as relief rather than affection. She was eager to establish her alibi, unaware that she was also removing herself from the battlefield her husband had prepared. Kenneth watched her drive away, knowing she was heading to Stephen's apartment to wait while her husband was murdered. Kenneth's transformation began the moment Angela's car turned the corner. The suburban husband disappeared, replaced by the tactical operator who'd earned his reputation in the mountains of Afghanistan. He killed all the lights in the house, activated his surveillance system, and descended to the basement command center where his weapons waited. The final hour before the attack passed in focused preparation. Kenneth donned dark tactical clothing, checked his equipment one last time, and positioned himself where he could monitor all approaches to the house. The waiting was familiar. He'd done it countless times in hostile territory, watching for enemies who thought they were the only predators in the darkness. At 10:47 p.m., Kenneth's perimeter sensors detected movement in the backyard. Four thermal signatures approached the house with military precision, using hand signals and coordinated movement patterns that marked them as professionals. They'd studied the house layout, identified entry points, and were executing their mission with the confidence of men who'd done this many times before. What Pierce's team couldn't see was the infrared grid Kenneth had established throughout his property, or the kill zones he prepared inside the house, or the weapons positioned at strategic points along their planned route. They were walking into a trap designed by someone who understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. Kenneth watched through his surveillance feeds as Pierce's team reached the back door. They used professional entry tools, worked with practice silence, and communicated through the kind of tactical sign language Kenneth recognized from his own military service. They were good at what they did, but they'd made one fatal error. They'd chosen to attack a man who was better. The lock clicked open at 10:58 p.m. Pierce's team paused, listening for any sign their entry had been detected. Hearing nothing, they began their infiltration, moving through Kenneth's house like shadows. What they didn't realize was that they were being watched by someone who'd become very comfortable operating in the darkness. Kenneth's pulse remained steady as the four men spread through his house, heading toward the bedroom where they expected to find their sleeping target. The next few minutes would determine whether months of preparation had been sufficient, whether a suburban mechanic could successfully transition back to being a lethal operator, and whether justice would be served to people who thought they could commit murder without consequences. The war Kenneth had been preparing for was about to begin, and only one side knew the battle had already started. Chapter 5. Blood in the Darkness. The four men moved through Kenneth's house with lethal precision, their night vision equipment turning the darkened rooms into a green-tinted tactical environment. Pierce led the team, his decades of covert operations experience evident in every calculated step. What he and his men couldn't see were the modifications Kenneth had made, the reinforced door frames that channeled movement, the hidden mirrors that provided sightlines, and the weapons caches positioned throughout the house. Kenneth watched from his basement command center as the team split into their predetermined formation. Two men headed toward the master bedroom, where they expected to find their target, while Pierce and the fourth operative covered the exits. It was textbook close-quarters combat methodology, executed by professionals who'd done this type of work many times before. The team's communication discipline was excellent. Hand signals only, no verbal contact that might wake their intended victim. They'd studied Kenneth's routine and knew he was a heavy sleeper who went to bed early. What they didn't know was that their target had been watching them watch him for weeks, and that every assumption they'd made about his capabilities was fatally wrong. Kenneth's counter-operation began when the first two men reached the master bedroom. Using his surveillance feeds, he tracked their exact positions as they prepared to breach the door. The lead operative had his suppressed pistol ready, while his partner positioned himself to secure the room after the elimination. They were seconds away from discovering that their target wasn't in bed. Kenneth emerged from the basement through a concealed entrance he'd built into the kitchen pantry, moving with the silence that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. His first target was the operative covering the back exit, the man positioned where Pierce thought Kenneth might try to escape if the assassination went wrong. The knife entered between the man's ribs before he even sensed Kenneth's presence, finding the heart with surgical precision. Kenneth caught the body as it fell, easing it to the floor without making a sound. 1 down, 3 to go, and the enemy still thought they were in control of the situation. Kenneth's second target was the operative positioned near the front door. This one required more finesse. The man was alert and positioned where the others could see him if he disappeared suddenly. Kenneth used a technique he'd perfected in Afghanistan, approaching from an angle that placed furniture between the target and his team members. The attack came from behind, Kenneth's hands finding the man's neck and applying pressure to the carotid arteries. It took exactly 12 seconds for the operative to lose consciousness, and another 8 for his neck to snap with a quiet pop that wouldn't carry beyond the immediate area. 2 down, and Pierce's team still hadn't realized they were under attack. The remaining 2 men were in the master bedroom, having just discovered that their target wasn't where he was supposed to be. Kenneth heard one of them hiss a quiet curse as they realized something was wrong. Pierce's voice came through their tactical radios, barely audible, but picked up by Kenneth's surveillance system. Target's not in bed. Check the house. Kenneth smiled grimly as he heard those words. Pierce was about to learn the difference between hunting a civilian and hunting someone who'd been trained to hunt them. Kenneth positioned himself in the hallway between the bedroom and the living areas, using shadows and the architectural modifications he'd made to remain invisible. When Pierce emerged from the bedroom, weapon ready and senses alert, Kenneth was waiting above him on a ledge he'd built into the ceiling space. Kenneth dropped onto Pierce's partner first, driving the man to the floor with crushing force. The impact stunned the operative, giving Kenneth time to snap his neck before he could cry out. The sound of the body hitting the floor alerted Pierce, but by then it was too late to save his team member. Pierce spun toward the sound, his weapon tracking through the darkness, but Kenneth had already moved. Years of close-quarters combat experience allowed Kenneth to anticipate Pierce's reaction, positioning himself where the team leader would be most vulnerable. The final confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Pierce was skilled, experienced, and desperate, but Kenneth fought with the cold precision of someone defending his home against intruders who'd come to murder him. Pierce's suppressed pistol fired twice, the bullets embedding in walls where Kenneth had been moments before. Kenneth's response was more direct and final. Pierce's neck broke with the same quiet efficiency Kenneth had used on his teammates. 4 professional killers laid dead in Kenneth's house, their mission incomplete and their employer about to face consequences they hadn't anticipated. Kenneth stood in his darkened living room, breathing slowly and deeply as his pulse returned to normal. The mechanical precision of the kills, the tactical awareness that had kept him alive, the cold calculation that had eliminated threats, it all felt familiar. He hadn't lost any of his edge during his civilian years. He'd simply been waiting for a reason to use it again. Kenneth checked his watch, 11:23 p.m. The entire operation had taken less than 25 minutes from breach to completion. Now came the next phase, the one Pierce and his team had never considered because they'd assumed Kenneth would be dead. Kenneth retrieved one of the dead operative's phones and scrolled through the contact list until he found the entry he was looking for, client. He composed a text message that would have been sent by Pierce if everything had gone according to plan. Package delivered. Clean exit completed. Wire transfer requested. Kenneth sent the message and waited for the response. It came within minutes, and the number was exactly what Kenneth had expected, Stephen Hathaway's personal cell phone. The confirmation Kenneth needed to proceed with the next phase of his operation. Kenneth's phone rang as he was positioning the bodies. Angela's name appeared on the caller ID, and Kenneth answered with the voice of a man who'd been awakened by an unusual sound. Kenneth? I heard something on the neighborhood app about activity in our area. Are you okay? Kenneth almost admired the performance. Angela was establishing her concern for her husband's welfare while actually checking to confirm his death. The caring wife act was perfectly executed, with just the right note of worry in her voice. I'm fine, honey. Thought I heard something outside, but it was probably just the wind. Are you having fun with the girls? Oh yes, we're having a great time. I'll probably stay at Cindy's tonight rather than drive home late. You don't mind, do you? Of course not. Sleep well. Kenneth ended the call knowing it would be the last conversation he'd ever have with his wife. Kenneth spent the next hour methodically erasing all evidence of his involvement in the evening's events. The bodies were staged to look like they'd been killed by each other during a home invasion gone wrong. The kind of criminal-on-criminal violence that would confuse investigators and provide no leads back to Kenneth. By 1 a.m., Kenneth had transformed his house back into a normal suburban home with no trace of the military operation that had just concluded. The 4 dead operatives looked like burglars who'd killed each other in a dispute over tactics, and Kenneth looked like a homeowner who'd slept through the entire incident. Kenneth poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in his kitchen, thinking about the text message he'd sent from Pierce's phone. Stephen and Angela were about to discover that their perfect murder plan had one fatal flaw. They'd chosen the wrong victim. Chapter 6. The Final Call. Kenneth waited in his kitchen until 2:30 a.m. before making his next move. He needed Angela and Stephen to believe their plan had succeeded long enough for them to incriminate themselves further. The text he'd sent from Pierce's phone would have convinced them that Kenneth was dead, setting up the final phase of his operation. Kenneth's phone rang at exactly 2:45 a.m. The caller ID showed Angela's number, but Kenneth let it go to voicemail. He needed to hear what she would say when she thought he couldn't answer, when she believed she was leaving a message for a dead man's phone. Angela's voice on the recording was perfect, panic, confusion, and fear that sounded genuine enough to fool investigators. Kenneth? Kenneth, are you there? I got a call from the alarm company saying there was activity at the house. I'm coming home right now. Please call me back. The performance was flawless, designed to create a timeline where Angela appeared to have received notification of the break-in and rushed home to check on her husband. It would have worked if Kenneth had actually been dead. Instead, it provided him with exactly the opportunity he needed. Kenneth activated the surveillance system he'd installed in Angela's car months earlier. The GPS tracker showed her leaving Stephen's downtown apartment at 2:47 a.m., right on schedule. Audio from the car's interior revealed Angela's true state of mind. It's done, she said into her phone. Kenneth's phone isn't answering, which means Pierce finished the job. I'm heading to the house now to discover the body and call 911. Remember, we never spoke tonight. Stephen's voice came through the car speakers. Are you sure you can handle seeing him like that? Pierce said it would be messy. I've been planning this for months, Stephen. I can handle a few minutes of acting traumatized before the police arrive. By this time tomorrow, I'll be a widow and Kenneth's assets will be mine. Kenneth turned off the recording and prepared for Angela's arrival. She expected to find her husband's body surrounded by evidence of a home invasion. Instead, she would find something much worse, a husband who knew exactly what she'd done. Kenneth positioned himself in the living room where Angela would see him immediately upon entering. The 4 dead operatives had been removed through his basement exit and disposed of in locations where they'd eventually be found, but with no connection to Kenneth's house. Instead, Kenneth had created a different scene entirely. When Angela's headlights swept across the front windows at 3:15 a.m., Kenneth was sitting calmly in his favorite chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and Pierce's phone on the coffee table beside him. The house lights were on. Everything looked normal, and Kenneth appeared to be very much alive. Angela's key turned in the front door, and Kenneth heard her practiced intake of breath as she prepared to discover her husband's body. Instead, she found Kenneth watching her with eyes that held no trace of the trusting husband she'd been deceiving. "Hello, Angela. You're home earlier than expected." Angela's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, fear, and then a desperate attempt to maintain her cover story. "Kenneth, thank God you're okay. I got a call from the alarm company about a break-in. Are you hurt? What happened?" Kenneth held up Pierce's phone. "I got a very interesting text message tonight from your friend Stephen. Something about a package being delivered and payment being due." Angela's face went white as she recognized the device. Kenneth could see her mind racing, trying to find an explanation that would maintain her innocence. But there was no innocent explanation for why her husband had Pierce's phone, and they both knew it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Angela said, but her voice carried the tremor of someone whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing. Kenneth stood up slowly, moving with a controlled precision that Angela had never seen before. "4 men came to kill me tonight, Angela. Professional killers hired by you and Stephen to eliminate your inconvenient husband. They expected to find a trusting mechanic who'd never suspect his wife's betrayal." "Kenneth, you're scaring me. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown." "They found something else instead," Kenneth continued, ignoring her protests. "They found someone who'd spent 3 tours in Afghanistan hunting men exactly like them. Someone who knew they were coming because he'd been watching his faithless wife plan his murder." Angela backed toward the door, finally understanding that her husband wasn't the man she'd thought he was. "Kenneth, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain." Kenneth's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You hired killers to murder your husband for money. In most places, that's called a capital crime." Angela's phone rang, the sound sharp in the tense silence. The caller ID showed Stephen's name, and Kenneth gestured for her to answer it. "Go ahead. Your partner is probably wondering why you haven't called to confirm that I'm dead." Angela answered with shaking hands. Stephen's voice was audible in the quiet room. "Did everything go as planned? Did you find a body?" Angela looked at Kenneth's impassive face and made her final choice. Instead of confessing, instead of begging for mercy, she decided to continue the deception that had already cost 4 men their lives. "Yes," she whispered into the phone. "It's done. Kenneth's dead." Kenneth smiled, a cold expression that Angela had never seen before. "Thank you for that. Stephen should be here shortly to help you stage your grief, shouldn't he? After all, you'll need witnesses to your discovery of your husband's body." Angela's legs gave out, and she collapsed into a chair. The elaborate plan she'd spent months perfecting had become her own trap, and the husband she'd thought was weak and trusting had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. "How long have you known?" she asked, abandoning any pretense of innocence. "Long enough to prepare for tonight. Long enough to understand that you weren't just planning to leave me, Angela. You were planning to have me killed. That changes the rules of engagement considerably." Kenneth walked to the window and looked out at the street. "Stephen should be arriving soon. He'll want to coordinate your stories before you call the police to report finding my body. Except there won't be any need for police reports because Stephen won't be making the return trip home." Angela started to speak, but Kenneth held up a hand for silence. A car was pulling into their driveway, Stephen's black Mercedes, arriving right on schedule to help Angela through her traumatic discovery. Kenneth checked his watch. 3:45 a.m. Time to finish what Angela and Stephen had started, but with an ending they hadn't planned for. Here's what's going to happen, Angela. Stephen is going to come through that door expecting to help you stage a crime scene. Instead, he's going to find out what happens when someone threatens the wrong person's life. Angela started to stand, perhaps thinking she could warn Stephen or run to his protection. Kenneth's voice stopped her cold. If you move from that chair, if you make any sound to warn him, I'll make sure your death takes considerably longer than his will. Do you understand me? Angela nodded, tears streaming down her face as she finally comprehended the type of man she'd been living with, the type of man she'd tried to have murdered. Stephen's footsteps approached the front door, and Kenneth positioned himself where he'd have the tactical advantage. The mechanic who'd been marked for death was gone, replaced by the operator who'd earned his reputation in the world's deadliest places. The final act of Angela and Stephen's plan was about to begin, but the ending would be written by someone who understood that betrayal carried a price that had to be paid in full. Chapter 7. Justice Without Mercy. Stephen entered the house with the confident stride of a man who believed his carefully orchestrated plan had succeeded. He expected to find Angela playing the role of traumatized widow, perhaps crying over Kenneth's body while they prepared their story for the police. Instead, he found his lover sitting frozen in a chair while her very much alive husband stood watching him with predatory stillness. Angela, what's... Stephen began, then stopped as his eyes met Kenneth's. The lawyer's practiced composure cracked as he processed the impossible scene before him. Stephen Hathaway, Kenneth said calmly. You're earlier than I expected, but punctuality has always been important in business transactions. Please come in. We need to discuss the status of your contract. Stephen's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Kenneth's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't recommend reaching for whatever you're carrying. The men you hired to kill me learned the hard way that I'm not the easy target you thought I was. Kenneth, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Stephen started, falling back on the attorney's instinct to negotiate his way out of dangerous situations. No misunderstanding at all. My wife hired Pierce and his team to murder me tonight. When that failed, you came here to help Angela stage the discovery of my body. The only miscalculation in your plan was assuming that a small-town mechanic would be defenseless against professional killers. Kenneth moved to the coffee table and picked up Pierce's phone, holding it where Stephen could see it. Pierce won't be completing his contract. Neither will his 3 associates. They made the mistake of breaking into the home of someone who spent years eliminating threats in much more challenging environments. Stephen's face went ashen as he understood the implications. Where are they? Scattered across various locations where they'll eventually be found. The local police will conclude they died in conflicts with other criminals, occupational hazards in their line of work. No trail leading back to you or Angela, which was very considerate of me. Angela found her voice, desperation making her bold. Stephen, he's lost his mind. He's talking about killing people. We need to call the police. Kenneth's laugh was devoid of humor. By all means, call them. Explain how you hired assassins to murder your husband, then came here to help stage the discovery of his body. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic to your situation. Stephen's attorney training kicked in, analyzing the situation for possible escape routes. Even if what you're saying is true, you can't prove we were involved. It's your word against ours. Kenneth pulled out his phone and played a recording of Angela's car conversation with Stephen. Their voices filled the room, discussing Kenneth's death with casual satisfaction, making plans for their new life together, and confirming the payment to Pierce's team. Digital surveillance has come a long way since your last murder, Stephen. I have recordings of every conversation, documentation of every meeting, and a complete timeline of your conspiracy. The only question now is how this story ends. Stephen tried a different approach, the desperate negotiation of a man who realized his life was in immediate danger. Look, Kenneth, we can work something out. If you know about the offshore accounts, you know there's more than enough money for everyone. We can make a deal. The same kind of deal you made with your previous marks? The ones who ended up committing suicide after you cleaned out their assets? I've done my research on you, Stephen. This isn't your first time orchestrating a spouse's murder. Kenneth's words hit Stephen like physical blows. The lawyer's face revealed his understanding that Kenneth knew everything, not just about the current conspiracy, but about Stephen's entire operation. Those were different circumstances, Stephen said weakly. Mental health issues, depression after the divorces, executions disguised as suicides. Very creative, very profitable, and completely undetectable until someone with the right background decided to investigate. Your mistake was choosing a target who knew how to hunt predators. Angela was sobbing now, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her denial. Kenneth, please. I'm sorry. I was confused. I made terrible choices, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can. You hired men to murder me in my sleep, Angela. You plan to inherit my assets and disappear with your lover. Counseling isn't going to address that level of betrayal. Kenneth's phone buzzed with a text message. He checked it and smiled, an expression that made both Angela and Stephen flinch. That was confirmation from an old military contact. Pierce's team has been connected to several unsolved murders across 3 states. When their bodies are found, investigators will assume they were eliminated by rival criminals. Very convenient for everyone involved. Stephen made a desperate play, lunging toward the front door in a bid for escape. Kenneth moved with liquid speed, intercepting Stephen before he'd taken 3 steps. The impact drove Stephen to the floor, and Kenneth's knee found pressure points that left the lawyer gasping and helpless. That was poorly thought out, Stephen. You're a soft man who spent his life manipulating others to do his violence for him. Running wasn't a realistic option. Kenneth hauled Stephen upright and positioned him next to Angela. Both conspirators sat facing their intended victim, understanding that they'd miscalculated in the most fatal way possible. Here's what's going to happen, Kenneth said, his voice carrying the finality of a military briefing. You're both going to pay for trying to have me murdered. Not through the legal system you've both learned to manipulate, but through a more direct form of justice. You can't just murder us, Stephen protested. You're not a killer. Kenneth's response was quiet and absolutely certain. I've killed more people than you can imagine, Stephen. The only difference is that now I'm doing it for personal reasons rather than national security. The mechanics remain the same. Angela looked at her husband with growing horror, finally seeing the man she'd actually married instead of the facade he'd maintained during their civilian life together. What are you going to do to us? Kenneth checked his watch again. 4:15 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, giving him time to complete his operation before the neighborhood started stirring. You planned my death very carefully, with attention to every detail that would protect you from consequences. I'm going to show you the same consideration by ensuring your disappearance is equally thorough. Kenneth's basement workshop contained everything he needed for the final phase of his operation. Angela and Stephen were about to discover that betraying a man with his background carried consequences they'd never imagined, and that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't tried to have him murdered. The mechanic was gone completely now, replaced by someone who understood that some debts could only be paid in blood. Chapter 8. The Cleaner's Art. Kenneth's basement workshop transformed into an interrogation facility with military efficiency. Within 30 minutes, he'd secured both Angela and Stephen to Chair's position where they could see each other but couldn't communicate effectively. The setup was designed for psychological pressure as much as physical restraint. Each conspirator would watch the other face consequences for their shared betrayal. I'm going to ask you some questions, Kenneth explained with the clinical detachment of a professional extracting intelligence. Your answers will determine how long this process takes, but they won't change the eventual outcome. You both try to have me murdered, and that debt has to be paid in full. Angela tried to maintain some vestige of the innocent victim role she'd perfected. Kenneth, I know you're hurt and angry, but this isn't who you are. You're a good man who wouldn't hurt his wife. You're right that this isn't who I was, Kenneth replied. The man you married was playing a role, just like you were. The difference is that my role was concealing someone much more dangerous than the person you were hiding. Kenneth pulled out a tablet, displaying financial records he'd compiled during his investigation. Let's start with the money, Stephen. Your offshore accounts show payments from at least 6 different suicide victims over the past 4 years. How many people have you murdered for their assets? Stephen's training as an attorney kicked in automatically. I'm not answering any questions without legal representation present. Kenneth's response was swift and educational. Pressure applied to specific nerve clusters left Stephen gasping and reconsidering his position on legal representation. This isn't a courtroom, Stephen. You're not entitled to an attorney, a phone call, or any of the constitutional protections you've spent your career manipulating. You're in the basement of a man you try to have killed, and your survival depends entirely on my mood. Angela watched Stephen's pain with growing terror, finally understanding that her husband possessed capabilities she'd never suspected. Kenneth, please, whatever you think we did, there has to be another explanation. The explanation is simple, Angela. You wanted my money and my death, so you hired professionals to murder me. When that failed, you and Stephen came here to stage the crime scene. Everything else is just details. Kenneth displayed photographs from his surveillance operations, images of Angela and Stephen's meetings, their romantic encounters, their conferences with Pierce's team. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniably damning. These photos will be found in Stephen's apartment after his disappearance, along with financial records linking him to multiple murders. The story will be that Stephen realized his operation was unraveling and eliminated his accomplices before fleeing the country. Stephen's composure finally cracked completely. You can't make this disappear. People know we were together tonight. Angela's friends, the restaurant staff, security cameras, all of which will support the official narrative. Angela left her girls' night early because she was upset about her relationship with Stephen. She came home to confront me about the affair. We argued, and she stormed out. Very dramatic, very believable, and completely consistent with the evidence I prepared. Kenneth's planning had been exhaustive. Angela's car would be found abandoned near the airport, suggesting she'd fled after Stephen's disappearance. Her phone records would show increasingly frantic attempts to contact Stephen, painting her as a panicked accomplice rather than a calculating conspirator. The beauty of it, Kenneth continued, is that you've both been so careful to hide your relationship that no one will think to connect your disappearances until it's too late. Stephen's history of murdering spouses for money will dominate the investigation. Angela's denial finally collapsed into desperate bargaining. We could give you everything back. The offshore accounts, the stolen money, all of it. Just let us disappear and you'll never see us again. The money was never the real issue, Angela. You could have divorced me and taken half of everything legally. Instead, you chose to have me murdered because you wanted it all and you thought I was too weak to stop you. Kenneth's methodical extraction of information continued for another hour. By the end, he had complete details of Stephen's entire operation, the names of his other victims, the locations of hidden assets, and the methods he'd used to avoid detection. Angela provided additional intelligence about their plans for Kenneth's assets and their intended escape route. One final question, Kenneth said as dawn began filtering through the basement windows. Do either of you want to confess to the families of Stephen's previous victims? Give them closure about what really happened to their loved ones. Both conspirators remained silent, confirming Kenneth's assessment that they were beyond redemption. Kenneth's execution of justice was swift and professional. Stephen died first, never knowing exactly when the final moment came. Angela's end took longer, not from cruelty, but because Kenneth wanted her to understand completely what betrayal had cost her. The cleanup took the rest of the morning. Kenneth's military training included body disposal techniques perfected in environments where evidence couldn't be left behind. Both Angela and Stephen would eventually be found, but in locations and conditions that supported the narrative Kenneth had constructed. By noon, Kenneth had sanitized his basement workshop and restored his house to normal suburban appearance. Angela's abandoned car was positioned near the airport, her phone programmed to send confused messages to Stephen's number at intervals that suggested growing panic. Stephen's apartment contained evidence linking him to multiple murders, financial fraud, and a hasty escape from the country. Kenneth returned to his auto shop and resumed his normal routine, the mechanic's mask firmly back in place. To anyone watching, he was just another small-town businessman dealing with the stress of his wife's apparent affair and subsequent disappearance. The investigation would unfold exactly as Kenneth had planned. Stephen would be identified as a serial killer who preyed on wealthy spouses. Angela would be seen as his final victim, and Kenneth would be viewed as the betrayed husband who'd lost everything to a sophisticated criminal. What no one would ever discover was that the mechanic who'd been marked for death had been someone else entirely. Someone who understood that justice sometimes required stepping outside the law, and that betrayal carried a price that had to be paid in full. Kenneth had eliminated every threat to his life and freedom, but the cost had been his faith in human nature and his ability to trust another person completely. Some victories left scars that never healed, and some justice came with a price that lasted forever. Chapter 9. After the Storm. 6 months after Angela's disappearance, Kenneth Bauer had become Pine Ridge's most sympathetic figure. The community rallied around the betrayed husband whose wife had been seduced by a serial killer and vanished without a trace. Local news coverage portrayed Kenneth as the devastated victim of Stephen Hathaway's sophisticated criminal operation, which had claimed victims across multiple states before finally unraveling. The FBI investigation concluded exactly as Kenneth had orchestrated. Stephen Hathaway was identified as the mastermind behind at least 7 murders disguised as suicides, with Angela Hansenbauer listed as his final victim. Evidence found in Stephen's apartment painted a picture of a man whose killing spree had spiraled out of control before he fled the country with his latest conquest. Kenneth played his role perfectly during the investigation. He provided investigators with the evidence he'd discovered of Angela's affair, expressed bewildered grief over her betrayal and disappearance, and cooperated fully with law enforcement efforts to trace Stephen's criminal network. To everyone watching, he was simply a heartbroken mechanic trying to rebuild his life after losing everything to forces beyond his control. The insurance payouts provided Kenneth with substantial assets: Angela's life insurance policy, compensation for Stephen's theft of marital property, even victim assistance funds for surviving family members of serial killers. The money meant nothing to Kenneth, but it provided the resources for his next chapter. Kenneth sold Bauer's auto repair to a young mechanic who'd been working for him part-time. The sale was structured to provide the new owner with favorable terms while giving Kenneth a clean break from his old life. He donated most of Angela's possessions to charity, keeping only items that serve as long-term plans. The house on Maple Street went on the market 3 months after Angela's disappearance. Kenneth told neighbors he couldn't bear living in a place with so many painful memories, which earned him additional sympathy while providing cover for his actual reasons for leaving. The basement workshop was carefully sanitized before the sale, all evidence of its true purpose removed without a trace. Kenneth's new home was a remote cabin in Montana, purchased through shell companies that couldn't be traced back to him. The property sat on 40 acres of wilderness, providing the isolation and security he needed for his actual retirement plans. To his Pine Ridge neighbors, he'd moved away to heal from his trauma. In reality, he'd simply relocated to a more suitable environment for his true nature. The cabin's basement contained a workshop that would have been familiar to Kenneth's military colleagues: weapons storage, communication equipment, and surveillance technology that kept him connected to events across the country. Kenneth hadn't retired from his war. He'd simply changed its scope and methodology. Kenneth's new identity was that of a trauma counselor specializing in helping victims of domestic violence and criminal conspiracies. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become an expert in helping people deal with exactly the kind of betrayal he'd eliminated from his own life. His clients found him remarkably insightful about the psychology of predators and the importance of permanent solutions to recurring threats. Some of Kenneth's counseling work was legitimate, helping genuine victims rebuild their lives and develop protective strategies. But some of his clients presented situations that reminded Kenneth of his own experience with Angela and Stephen. These cases required a different kind of intervention, one that drew on Kenneth's specialized skills rather than conventional therapy techniques. A year after Pine Ridge, Kenneth received a visit from a woman whose husband had hired killers to eliminate her after draining their assets. The local police had been compromised, the FBI investigation had stalled, and she was living under assumed identities while professional assassins hunted her. Kenneth listened to her story with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was facing. When she finished, he made a phone call to contacts who specialized in making dangerous people disappear permanently. Within a week, the woman's problems had been resolved with the same thoroughness Kenneth had applied to his own situation. Word of Kenneth's unique counseling success spread through networks that existed outside conventional law enforcement channels. Victims who'd exhausted legal options began finding their way to his Montana retreat, bringing situations that required Kenneth's particular expertise. Each case was evaluated carefully, and solutions were implemented with the precision that had made Kenneth legendary in certain military circles. Kenneth never advertised his services or actively recruited clients. People found him through referrals from previous clients or through connections in the underground networks that helped victims when the system failed them. His reputation grew slowly, but consistently. The counselor who helped people when no one else could, who understood that some problems required permanent solutions. The mechanic's mask was gone forever, replaced by the persona of a trauma specialist who'd suffered his own devastating losses. Kenneth's clients saw him as someone who understood their pain because he'd experienced similar betrayal. What they didn't realize was that his understanding came from being the solution to the problem rather than its victim. Kenneth's Montana cabin included a small cemetery in the woods behind the house. Unmarked graves containing the remains of people who'd made the mistake of threatening his client's safety. Each burial represented a case where rehabilitation had been impossible and elimination had been necessary. Kenneth maintained the cemetery with the same attention to detail he'd applied to his military operations. 5 years after Pine Ridge, Kenneth had become something unique in American criminal justice. A one-man court of last resort for victims who couldn't find justice through conventional means. His success rate was perfect, his methods were untraceable, and his clients' problems stayed solved permanently. Kenneth never remarried, never formed close personal relationships, and never again made the mistake of trusting someone completely. He'd learned that betrayal was a fundamental risk of human connection, and he'd chosen to minimize that risk by maintaining emotional distance from everyone in his life. The war that had begun in his suburban home had evolved into something larger and more purposeful. Kenneth had become judge, jury, and executioner for people who preyed on the innocent, using skills learned in service to his country to provide justice for victims the system couldn't protect. In quiet moments, Kenneth sometimes thought about the husband he'd been before Angela's betrayal. Trusting, optimistic, believing in the possibility of lasting love. That man had died in the basement workshop on Maple Street, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous to the predators who thought they could hurt innocent people without consequences. Kenneth Bauer had found his true calling in the ashes of his destroyed marriage. He'd become exactly what people like Angela and Stephen should fear most. Someone with the skills to eliminate them and the motivation to never show mercy to anyone who chose betrayal over honor. The mechanic was gone. The operator remained, and he was just getting started. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Blake Morrison stood in his kitchen, watching the morning sun filter through the pristine windows of his suburban home. At 38, he maintained the disciplined physique of his military years, though most people who knew him now saw only a successful private security consultant living the American dream. His wife Trinity hummed softly as she prepared coffee, her blonde hair catching the light in a way that once made his heart race. 15 years of Special Forces operations in classified locations had taught Blake to read people like open books. He could detect lies and micro-expressions, sense danger in environmental changes, and eliminate threats with surgical precision. Yet somehow, he had chosen to ignore the subtle signs that had been accumulating for months. Trinity's late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. The new lingerie that never made an appearance in their bedroom. The way she avoided eye contact during intimate conversations. The expensive gifts she claimed were from her marketing job, despite him knowing her exact salary. "I'll be visiting my parents this weekend," Trinity announced, not looking up from her phone. "The house needs some maintenance work, and Dad's back is acting up again." Blake nodded, spooning eggs onto his plate. Frank and Dorothy Ashford had always treated him with polite distance, never quite accepting their daughter's choice to marry a man from Blake's blue-collar background. The old Victorian house on Elm Street had been Trinity's childhood home before her parents moved to a retirement community in Florida 2 years ago. "Need any help? I could drive up with you," Blake offered, though he knew the answer. "No, it's fine. Just boring family stuff. Besides, you have that Patterson security consultation this weekend." She was right about the consultation, but Blake found it curious how well Trinity tracked his schedule lately, almost as if she were ensuring she knew when he'd be unavailable. After Trinity left that Friday afternoon, Blake completed the Patterson job, a comprehensive security overhaul for a tech executive who'd receive credible threats. The work was routine, but it kept his tactical skills sharp. Blake had learned long ago that complacency could be fatal. By Saturday evening, an inexplicable restlessness had settled over him. His instincts, honed by years of dangerous operations, were sending subtle warnings he couldn't ignore. Something felt wrong about Trinity's story. On impulse, Blake drove to the Ashford house on Elm Street. He told himself he was being paranoid, that marriage counseling might be a better solution than surveillance. But as he turned onto the quiet street lined with mature oak trees, his training took over. The house sat dark and imposing against the night sky, its Victorian gingerbread trim casting intricate shadows in the moonlight. Blake parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive in hostile territories. The front door was locked, but Blake had learned lock-picking from a former CIA operative during a joint mission in Afghanistan. The skill proved useful now as he slipped inside the dusty interior. The house smelled of neglect and something else, something that made Blake's combat instincts flare to life. Following the scent, he climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor. The smell grew stronger as he approached the master bedroom. Blake pushed open the door and froze. A young woman, maybe 25, was handcuffed to the ornate brass bed frame. Her auburn hair was matted, her clothes dirty and torn. She looked up at Blake with eyes that held both terror and desperate hope. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth. Blake's military training kicked in instantly. He scanned the room for threats, confirmed they were alone, then approached the girl slowly to avoid frightening her further. "I'm here to help," he whispered, carefully removing the tape from her mouth. "Are you hurt?" "Please," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "They said they'd kill me if I screamed. I've been here for 3 days." Blake examined the handcuffs, professional grade, not something purchased at a novelty store. "Who did this to you?" "A woman with blonde hair and a man with a scar on his neck. They knew things about me. Personal things. They said I needed to disappear for a while." Blake's blood turned to ice. Trinity had blonde hair, and she'd mentioned a new friend from her yoga class, someone named Victor who had a distinctive scar from a motorcycle accident. With hands that barely trembled, Blake called Trinity's number. "Hey, baby." Her voice came through the speaker, cheerful and normal. "How's your evening?" "I'm at your parents' house," Blake said carefully. "I was worried about you working here alone." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. When Trinity spoke again, her tone had changed completely. "We don't live there anymore, Blake. Why would you go there?" The line went dead. Blake stared at his phone, then at the terrified young woman handcuffed to the bed. In that moment, he realized his marriage had been a carefully constructed lie, and he was about to discover just how deep the deception ran. Chapter 2: Shadows of Truth. Blake worked quickly to free the young woman, using a paperclip to pick the handcuff locks, another skill from his covert operations days. As the metal restraints clicked open, she rubbed her wrists and struggled to sit up. "What's your name?" Blake asked, helping her to the edge of the bed. "Iris Novak," she whispered. "I'm a journalist with the Metro Herald. I was investigating." God, this is going to sound crazy. "Try me." Iris looked at Blake intently, as if measuring whether she could trust him. "I was investigating a human trafficking network operating through legitimate businesses. High-end escorts, forced labor, the works. The trail led me to a marketing firm downtown, Prestige Communications." Blake's stomach dropped. That was Trinity's company. 3 days ago, I was leaving the office after a meeting with a source when these two people approached me in the parking garage. The woman said she knew I'd been asking questions about her business. Before I could react, the man injected something into my neck. Blake helped Iris to her feet, noting she was steady despite her ordeal. "You said they knew personal things about you. Details only someone with access to police databases or government records would know. My social security number, my sister's address in Oregon, the fact that my parents died in a car accident when I was 16. Iris's voice strengthened as she spoke. "This isn't some random crime, Mr. Morrison." "Blake Morrison." He watched her reaction carefully. Iris's eyes widened. "Morrison? Are you married to Trinity Morrison from Prestige Communications?" "Yes." "Then you're in danger too. My investigation uncovered evidence that someone at Prestige has been using the company's client database to identify and target vulnerable women. Single mothers, recent immigrants, women with no family ties. They promise high-paying jobs, then force them into situations they can't escape." Blake's mind raced through the implications. Trinity's expensive gifts, her secretive phone calls, her precise knowledge of his schedule. How long has this been going on? At least 2 years, possibly longer. But here's the thing. The operation is too sophisticated for amateurs. Someone with serious resources and connections is running this. Blake helped Iris down the stairs, his military paranoia now in full operation mode. "We need to get you to safety and figure out our next move." "I can't go to the police," Iris said urgently. "Part of my investigation revealed that someone inside the police department is feeding information to the traffickers. That's how they stay ahead of any investigations." As they reached the front door, Blake's phone buzzed with a text message from Trinity. "Blake, I know you're confused. Meet me at Murphy's Diner on Highway 9 tomorrow at noon. I can explain everything." Blake showed the message to Iris. "She's trying to control the situation," she said immediately. "That's classic predator behavior. When confronted, they try to regain control through manipulation." "Murphy's Diner," Blake mused. "It's isolated, only one road in and out. Easy to monitor who's coming and going." "You're not actually going to meet her?" Blake's expression hardened, the soldier in him emerging. "Oh, I'm going, but not the way she expects." Blake drove Iris to a safe house he maintained, an unremarkable apartment downtown that he'd kept from his military days, unknown to Trinity or anyone else. It was stocked with cash, weapons, surveillance equipment, and everything needed to disappear or conduct operations. "This is where you'll stay until we sort this out," Blake told Iris as he activated the security system. "The building has facial recognition cameras, and I'll know if anyone approaches." Iris examined the apartment's sophisticated security setup. "You're not just a security consultant, are you?" "I used to solve problems for the government, the kind that don't exist in official records." Over the next several hours, Blake and Iris pieced together the scope of the operation. Using his contacts and private intelligence, Blake accessed records that painted a disturbing picture. Prestige Communications had client files on over 300 women who fit the trafficking profile. Cross-referencing with missing persons reports revealed that at least 20 of those women had disappeared over the past 2 years. Trinity's been using her legitimate job as cover, Blake realized. She identifies targets through the marketing consultations, then feeds their information to her partner. "Victor Reyes," Iris said, pulling up a file on her laptop. "I managed to photograph him before they grabbed me. Former military police, dishonorably discharged for assault. Since then, he's been connected to several criminal enterprises, but nothing that stuck in court. Blake studied Victor's photograph. The scar on his neck was prominent, and his eyes held the cold calculation Blake recognized in career criminals. Military police explains the professional handcuffs and injection technique. There's more, Iris said grimly. My source inside Prestige mentioned that Trinity and Victor have been planning something big. A final score before they disappear. Something involving a high-value target. Blake's phone buzzed again. Another text from Trinity. I love you, Blake. Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. Trust me one more time. This time, Blake responded, see you at noon tomorrow. But Blake Morrison was no longer the trusting husband. He was a hunter preparing to destroy his prey, and Trinity and Victor had no idea what kind of predator they had awakened. Chapter 3. The Trap Within the Trap. Blake spent the early morning hours conducting reconnaissance on Murphy's Diner. Located 15 miles outside the city on a rural highway, the diner sat in a valley surrounded by wooded hills. Perfect terrain for someone with Blake's training to observe and control. Using military-grade binoculars, Blake identified 3 vehicles positioned around the diner that didn't belong. A black sedan with tinted windows parked behind the building, a van with surveillance equipment barely visible through its rear windows, and a motorcycle hidden in the tree line. Victor's preferred mode of transportation based on Iris's intelligence. Trinity wasn't planning to explain anything. She was planning an ambush. Blake smiled grimly. They had underestimated him completely. By 11:30, Blake was positioned on a ridge overlooking the diner, wearing tactical gear and carrying enough firepower to handle a small army. Through his scope, he watched Trinity enter the diner and take a booth with clear sight lines to the entrance. She kept checking her phone nervously. At exactly noon, Blake's phone rang. Where are you? Trinity's voice was strained. I'm here waiting. I'm watching you, Blake replied calmly. Along with Victor in the sedan, 2 more men in the van, and someone on the motorcycle. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Blake, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You and Victor have been trafficking women for at least 2 years. You use your job to identify targets, and he handled the kidnapping and disposal. You kept me around as cover, the respectable husband who provided legitimacy. That's not. Iris Novak told me everything. Blake interrupted. She's safe, by the way. Your plan to silence her failed. Another long pause. When Trinity spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Cold and calculating. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Blake. Victor has connections you can't imagine. People in law enforcement, in government. If you interfere with our business, you'll disappear just like the others. Interesting threat from someone who's about to find out what 15 years of Black Ops training actually means. Blake ended the call and began moving. His first target was the motorcycle in the tree line. The rider never saw Blake coming. One moment, he was monitoring radio chatter from a van. The next, he was unconscious from a precisely applied chokehold. Blake zip-tied the man's hands and feet, took his radio and weapons, then sabotaged the motorcycle's engine. The van was parked on a service road behind the diner. Blake approached from the vehicle's blind spot, using skills learned in urban warfare environments. Through the van's rear window, he could see 2 men monitoring electronic surveillance equipment. Blake attached a small explosive device to the van's fuel tank. Not enough to kill, but sufficient to disable the vehicle and create chaos. He set the timer for 3 minutes, then moved toward the sedan. Victor Reyes was exactly where Blake expected him to be, positioned behind the diner with a clear view of the front entrance. The former military police officer was well-trained, but he was focused on watching for Blake to arrive, not on defending against an attack from behind. Blake's approach was silent and professional. He disabled Victor with a combat knife, placed precisely at the base of his skull, applying just enough pressure to penetrate skin without causing permanent damage. Move, and I'll sever your spinal cord, Blake whispered. Victor froze completely. Blake, are you safe? For now. What did you find? Trinity's computer files contain a complete client database with over 400 women. But that's not the worst part. I found financial records showing payments to law enforcement officials, court personnel, even someone in the FBI. Blake closed his eyes, absorbing the scope of the corruption. How high does it go? Deputy Director Charles Brennan has been receiving monthly payments of $50,000. Blake, this network has protection at the federal level. Blake looked back at Trinity and Victor, who were watching him intently. Then the official channels are compromised. We'll have to handle this differently. What do you mean? I mean some problems require permanent solutions. Blake ended the call and returned to the booth. Trinity and Victor had been whispering urgently, but fell silent as he approached. Good news, Blake announced. My journalist friend has found evidence of your entire network, including your corrupt protectors. Bad news for you is that the corruption goes so high that normal legal channels can't be trusted. Victor sneered. So you're stuck. You can't turn us in without risking your precious evidence disappearing. Actually, Blake said, settling back into his seat, it just means I'm free to handle this my way. Blake pulled out his phone and showed them a series of photographs he'd taken during his reconnaissance. The disabled surveillance van, the unconscious operatives, the sabotaged motorcycle. You see, the beautiful thing about having your entire support network compromised is that no one will investigate too closely when you disappear. Your corrupt cops will assume you left town to avoid exposure. Your government contacts will be too busy covering their own tracks to look for you. Trinity's face went pale. Blake, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life, Blake replied. You've enslaved innocent women, murdered journalists, and corrupted the justice system. You think you deserve to live after that? Victor lunged across the table, but Blake was ready. The former Special Forces operative moved with lethal precision, grabbing Victor's throat and slamming him back into his seat. Try that again, and I'll demonstrate what a collapsed windpipe sounds like, Blake said calmly. He looked at Trinity, seeing the full scope of her evil for the first time. I loved you. I trusted you. I built my life around you. And you used all of that to cover your crimes against innocent people. Blake, please. The woman I married doesn't exist, Blake continued. She was just a mask worn by a monster. And monsters need to be put down. Blake stood up, his decision made. Trinity and Victor had corrupted the system designed to bring them to justice. That left only one option. It was time for Blake Morrison to return to what he did best, eliminating threats to innocent people. Chapter 5. The Hunter's Preparation. Blake zip-tied Trinity and Victor to their booth seats, ensuring they couldn't escape while he prepared for what came next. From his vehicle, he retrieved a duffel bag containing specialized equipment from his military days, items he'd hoped never to use again. What are you planning? Trinity asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake ignored her, methodically laying out his tools on the table. Zip ties, duct tape, tactical restraints, and a selection of implements designed for information extraction. This is insane, Victor said, but his bravado was gone now. You're talking about murder. That makes you just like us. Blake looked at Victor with cold disgust. I killed enemy combatants who were trying to harm innocent people. You enslaved innocent women for profit and murdered journalists for asking questions. We are nothing alike. Blake's phone rang. Iris. Blake, I've been monitoring police scanners. Multiple units are heading toward the diner. Someone must have reported the explosion. How long do I have? Maybe 15 minutes. Blake looked at his prisoners, then made a decision. I'm moving them to a secure location. Continue analyzing the files. I want a complete list of victims and collaborators. Blake, what are you planning to do? What should have been done years ago? Blake cut Trinity and Victor's restraints, then forced them at gunpoint toward the diner's rear exit. His vehicle, a modified SUV with reinforced windows and run-flat tires, was parked behind the building. Where are you taking us? Trinity demanded. Somewhere we won't be interrupted. Blake drove deep into the mountains, following logging roads that hadn't seen traffic in years. His destination was an abandoned mining facility he'd scouted during his reconnaissance of the area. Remote, soundproof, and equipped with industrial equipment that could prove useful. The mining office building still had electricity and water, maintained by a caretaker service that Blake had used for legitimate security training exercises. No one would disturb them here. Blake secured Trinity and Victor in separate rooms, then began his interrogation. I want a complete list of every woman you've trafficked, Blake told Victor. Names, dates, locations. I want to know which ones are still alive and where they're being held. Go to hell, Victor spat. Blake pulled out a device that looked like a modified car battery charger. This is a field interrogation kit, military issue. It delivers precisely calibrated electrical impulses designed to cause maximum pain without permanent damage, unless I adjust the settings. Victor's face went pale. I used this on Taliban commanders who were planning suicide attacks on civilian markets, Blake continued. They always talked eventually. The question is how much pain you want to endure first. You're bluffing. You're not a killer. Blake attached the electrodes to Victor's wrists. I've killed 47 people in defense of innocent lives. Adding one more won't bother me. The first pulse made Victor scream and convulse against his restraints. That was level 1, Blake said calmly. There are 10 levels. Level 6 causes permanent nerve damage. Level 10 stops the heart. Wait. Victor gasped. I'll tell you what you want to know. Over the next hour, Victor provided a complete breakdown of their operation. 17 women were currently being held in various locations around the city. Another 23 had been sold to clients in other states. The rest, Victor's voice broke as he admitted, had been murdered when they became too difficult to control. Blake recorded everything, his rage building with each revelation. The clients, Blake said, I want names and addresses. Victor hesitated, then provided a list that included politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Blake moved to Trinity's room next. Your turn, he said simply. Trinity tried a different approach, seduction, manipulation, appeals to their shared history. None of it worked. You're not the woman I married, Blake told her. That woman was a fiction created to provide cover for a monster. The monster is who you really are. When Trinity refused to cooperate, Blake applied the same techniques he'd used on Victor. She broke more quickly, providing financial records, client lists, and details about the corrupt officials who protected their operation. The women who are still alive, Blake said. Where are they being held? Good. Now we're going to have a conversation about your business model. Blake zip-tied Victor's hands behind his back and confiscated his weapons. 2 pistols, a knife, and a taser. Then he marched Victor toward the diner's rear entrance just as the van exploded in the distance. Trinity burst out of the diner at the sound of the explosion, her composure finally cracking. She stopped short when she saw Blake pushing Victor ahead of him at knife point. Hello, Trinity, Blake said conversationally. I think it's time we had that explanation you promised. Trinity's face cycled through fear, anger, and desperation before settling on defiance. You can't prove anything. Whatever that journalist told you, it's her word against ours. Actually, I can prove quite a lot. Blake produced a small recording device. For instance, I can prove you just threatened to have me killed by Victor's government connections. I can prove you admitted to running a human trafficking operation. And I can prove you've been lying to me for years. Blake, please. Trinity's voice took on a pleading tone. We can work this out. The money we've made, there's enough to disappear together. Start over somewhere else. Blake studied his wife's face, seeing clearly for the first time the cold calculation behind her blue eyes. You really think I'd become your accomplice? Help you traffic innocent women? You killed people in the military, Trinity shot back. Ow, is this different? I killed enemies who were trying to harm innocent people, Blake replied. You enslaved innocent people for profit. If you can't see the difference, then you're even more lost than I thought. Victor struggled against his restraints. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Morrison. This operation has protection at levels you can't reach. Blake pressed the knife deeper, drawing a drop of blood. Keep talking. I'm recording everything. Blake, Trinity said desperately, I love you. I always have. This business, it was Victor's idea. He manipulated me, made me think we needed the money. Blake looked at his wife with disgust. Even now, you're lying. Iris's investigation shows you initiated contact with Victor, not the other way around. You recruited him because you needed someone with military skills to handle the physical aspects of the operation. Trinity's mask finally dropped completely. Fine. Yes, I started it. Yes, I use my job to find targets. And yes, I married you because a special forces husband provided perfect cover. But you know what, Blake? I don't regret any of it. Those women were weak. They allowed themselves to be victims. Blake stared at this stranger who wore his wife's face. And now you're going to face justice for what you've done to them. What justice? Trinity laughed bitterly. You think the police will believe you? Victor's right about our connections. By tomorrow, you'll be wanted for assault and kidnapping, and we'll be free. Blake smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made both Trinity and Victor take involuntary steps backward. Who said anything about involving the police? Chapter 4. The Network Revealed. Blake forced Trinity and Victor into the diner at knife point, herding them toward a back booth where they couldn't be seen from the road. The waitress, an elderly woman named Agnes, had fled when the van exploded, leaving the restaurant empty. Sit, Blake commanded, positioning himself where he could watch both the front door and his prisoners. We're going to discuss the full scope of your operation. Victor remained defiant despite the blood trickling down his neck. You're making a mistake, Morrison. People know we're here. When we don't check in. You mean like your 3 associates who are currently unconscious and zip-tied? Blake interrupted. I've already disabled your entire support team. Trinity's eyes darted between Blake and the front windows. You can't hold us here indefinitely. Someone will call the police. Let them come, Blake said calmly. I have recordings of both of you admitting to human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder, plus physical evidence from the house on Elm Street and Iris Novak's testimony. Blake leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used when interrogating insurgents. But I'm more interested in the scope of your network. Iris mentioned you have protection in law enforcement and government. I want names. Victor laughed harshly. You think we give up our protection? You're stupider than I thought. Blake pulled out his combat knife and placed it on the table between them. The blade caught the fluorescent light, its edge honed to surgical sharpness. I've extracted information from Taliban commanders and Russian intelligence operatives, Blake said conversationally. Compared to them, you two are amateurs. Trinity's bravado cracked slightly. Blake, you wouldn't what? Use the same techniques I use to protect American lives overseas? The difference is, you two are actually guilty of the crimes I'm investigating. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Iris. Found something big in Trinity's files. Call me when safe. Your journalist friend is still digging, Blake told them. She's very thorough. I suspect she's already found evidence that will implicate your entire network. Victor's jaw tightened. Novak is a problem that needs to be eliminated. Interesting choice of words, Blake said, starting the recording app on his phone. Please elaborate on how you eliminate problems. We make them disappear, Victor said coldly. Permanently, just like we're going to do with you. Trinity shot Victor a warning look, but the damage was done. Blake nodded thoughtfully. So you admit to murder. How many women have you killed, Victor? Enough to perfect the technique. Blake, stop this, Trinity pleaded. Victor doesn't know what he's saying. He's in shock from the injury. Actually, he's being very helpful, Blake replied. Keep going, Victor. Tell me about your government connections. Victor seemed to realize he was being manipulated, but his anger overrode his caution. You want to know about connections? Fine. Detective Ray Hutchins with Metro PD has been feeding us information about investigations for 18 months. He gets 20% of our profits. Anyone else? Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos helps us identify which cases to worry about and which ones will disappear. She's been very useful. Trinity looked horrified. Victor, shut up. But Victor was beyond reason now, his military training warped by years of criminal activity. And your precious Iris Novak? She's not the first journalist who got too close. We dealt with 2 others, a reporter from Channel 7 and a freelancer who was investigating missing persons cases. Blake felt cold fury building in his chest. Dealt with them how? The same way we deal with all problems. They went for boat rides and forgot how to swim. Blake had heard enough. These weren't just criminals. They were serial killers operating under the protection of corrupt officials. The justice system they had compromised couldn't be trusted to handle them properly. I need to make a phone call, Blake announced, standing up. Don't move. Blake walked to the front of the diner and called Iris. "There's a warehouse on Industrial Boulevard," Trinity sobbed. "And a house in Riverside. Blake, please, I can help you rescue them. I know where everything is." "You're going to help me," Blake agreed. "But not the way you think." Blake spent the evening reviewing the intelligence he'd gathered. 17 women held in 2 locations, guarded by at least 6 armed men. Multiple corrupt officials who would interfere with any official rescue attempt. And a client list that read like a who's who of the city's power structure. The scope of the problem was beyond what any individual could handle through legal channels. But Blake wasn't planning to use legal channels. He called Iris from a secure phone. "I have intelligence on the entire operation," he told her. "Locations, victim names, client lists, financial records. Everything needed to expose the network." "That's incredible. We can take this to federal authorities." "The corruption goes to the federal level," Blake interrupted. "Deputy Director Brennan at the FBI has been taking payments. We can't trust official channels." "Then what do we do?" "You're going to release everything to the media. Every major news outlet, every social media platform, every journalist in the country. Make it impossible to suppress or ignore." "What about the women who are still being held?" Blake looked through the window at Trinity and Victor, who were secured in the mining facilities holding cells. "I'm going to rescue them. Tonight." "Blake, you can't do this alone. It's too dangerous. I've conducted solo rescue operations in hostile territory before. This is what I'm trained for." Blake ended the call and began preparing for what would likely be the most important mission of his life. 17 innocent women were counting on him, whether they knew it or not. And Trinity and Victor were about to learn what happened to people who enslave the innocent. Chapter 6, The Reckoning Begins. Blake stood over Trinity and Victor in their separate holding cells, both now restrained with military-grade restraints that left no possibility of escape. The mining facility's isolation was perfect. No one would hear what happened next. "Before I rescue the women you've enslaved," Blake said calmly, "you're going to experience exactly what you put them through." Trinity looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Blake, I know you hate me, but please, we could disappear together. Start over. I can change." Blake studied the woman he'd once loved, seeing only a predator desperate to escape consequences. "You spent years lying to my face while you tortured innocent people. You married me to provide cover for your crimes. Every kiss, every I love you, every moment of intimacy was just part of your deception." "That's not true. I did love you." "You loved having cover for your operations," Blake interrupted. "A special forces husband provided credibility and protection. That's all I ever was to you." Blake turned to Victor, who was trying to maintain his defiance despite the circumstances. "And you took Trinity's weakness and turned it into something monstrous. You convinced her that innocent people were acceptable casualties for your profit." "Those women made their own choices," Victor snarled. "They wanted easy money. We just showed them the reality of their decisions." Blake pulled out his combat knife, its blade gleaming in the fluorescent light. "Let me show you the reality of your decisions." Blake began with Victor's expensive watch, cutting it off his wrist. Then his wallet, his phone, his jewelry, everything that represented his identity and status. "Strip," Blake commanded. "What?" "You heard me. Everything off. Now." When Victor hesitated, Blake pressed the knife to his throat. "Your victims were forced to strip for your clients. Experience what they experienced. Humiliated and terrified, Victor complied." Blake repeated the process with Trinity, ignoring her pleas and tears. "Your victims felt this same humiliation, this same helplessness. The difference is they were innocent." Blake handcuffed both prisoners to chains hanging from the ceiling, the same position their victims had been forced to endure. Then he left them alone in the dark, cold cells. "I'll be back," Blake announced. "Think about what your victims went through while I'm gone rescuing the women you enslaved." Blake drove toward the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard, his vehicle loaded with tactical gear and weapons. Through Iris's intelligence network, he confirmed that 6 armed guards were holding 9 women in the converted warehouse. The building sat in an industrial area surrounded by empty lots and abandoned structures. perfect for Blake's purposes. Using night vision equipment, he conducted a thorough reconnaissance of the facility. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter. 2 more were stationed inside the main warehouse area. Another 2 monitored the office areas where the women were likely being held. Blake began his assault at midnight. The first perimeter guard never saw Blake coming. A sleeper hold rendered him unconscious in seconds. Blake zip-tied him and moved to the second guard, who was eliminated with equal efficiency. Entry into the warehouse required more finesse. Blake used lock-picking skills to access a side door, then moved through the building with the silent precision of a professional operator. The 2 interior guards were positioned near a bank of security monitors. Blake approached from her blind spot and neutralized both simultaneously, one with a chokehold, the other with a pressure point technique that caused instant unconsciousness. Blake found the women in a series of converted office spaces that had been turned into makeshift cells. They were in various states of physical and psychological trauma, some barely conscious from drugs, others huddled in corners terrified to move. "I'm here to rescue you," Blake announced softly. "My name is Blake Morrison. I'm going to get you out of here." The rescue operation took 30 minutes. Blake used his military medical training to assess each woman's condition, providing immediate first aid where needed. He called for ambulances and trauma counselors, ensuring each victim would receive appropriate care. As sirens approached the warehouse, Blake disappeared into the night. He had one more location to hit before dawn. The house in Riverside presented different challenges. It was located in a residential neighborhood where stealth was more critical than firepower. Blake's approach had to be surgical. Using surveillance equipment, he confirmed that 8 women were being held in the basement level of an apparently normal suburban home. 4 guards provided security, and neighbors were close enough to hear gunfire. Blake's solution was elegant and brutal. He cut the power to the entire block, then used the confusion to enter the house through a second-story window. Moving through the darkened building like a ghost, he systematically eliminated each guard using silent techniques. The women in the basement were in worse condition than those at the warehouse. Several showed signs of severe physical abuse, and all were suffering from malnutrition and psychological trauma. Blake called 911 from the guard's phone, reporting a medical emergency at the address. Then he vanished before emergency responders arrived. By dawn, 17 women had been rescued, and dozens of media outlets were receiving comprehensive intelligence packages from IRIS documenting the entire trafficking network. The corruption scandal was about to explode across every news channel in the country. Blake returned to the mining facility as the sun rose over the mountains. Trinity and Victor were still chained in their cells, exhausted and terrified from a night of experiencing what their victims had endured. "How does it feel?" Blake asked them. "Being helpless, not knowing what's going to happen to you? That's what you put those women through, except their ordeal lasted months or years." "Blake," Trinity whispered, "please. I know I can never make up for what I've done, but I can help you ensure this never happens again. I can testify against the corrupt officials." Blake looked at his wife, former wife. He corrected himself with something approaching pity. "You still don't understand. This isn't about justice anymore. This is about consequences." Blake pulled out his phone and showed them news footage from the rescue operations. Emergency responders treating traumatized women. Police arresting guards. FBI agents raiding government offices as the corruption scandal exploded. "The women you enslaved are free," Blake announced. "Your network is exposed. Your corrupt protectors are being arrested. Everything you built is destroyed." "Then it's over," Victor said desperately. "You won. Let us go." Blake smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made both prisoners recoil. "Let you go? After what you've done?" Blake shook his head. "No, we're just getting started." Chapter 7. Justice Delivered. Blake stood in the mining facility's main room, surrounded by the evidence of Trinity and Victor's crimes spread across multiple tables. Financial records, victim photos, client lists, and recorded confessions created a comprehensive picture of their trafficking network's scope and brutality. On his laptop, news coverage played continuously. FBI raids on corrupt officials' homes. emergency responders treating rescued victims, politicians and police officers being arrested in handcuffs. The scandal was dominating every news cycle in the country. "You see this," Blake called to his prisoners. "This is what happens when monsters get exposed to the light." Trinity and Victor, still chained in their cells, looked haggard after their night of experiencing helplessness. But Blake wasn't finished with them yet. "I've been thinking about appropriate consequences for your crimes," Blake announced, walking between their cells. "The justice system you corrupted can't be trusted to handle this properly. Too many of your collaborators are still in positions of power." Blake pulled out a tablet showing surveillance footage he'd recorded during the rescue operations. 17 women freed from your operation. But according to your confessions, you murdered at least 34 others over the past 2 years. "Blake, please," Trinity begged. "I can help you find the bodies. Give their families closure. Isn't that worth something?" "It might be," Blake agreed, "if I believed you were capable of genuine remorse. But you're not. You're just trying to manipulate me one more time." Blake activated a wall-mounted television screen. On it, interviews with the rescued women played silently, their faces blurred to protect their identities, but their words devastating in their impact. "These women are telling their stories," Blake said, "about how you lured them with false job offers, how you drugged them, chained them, forced them to service your clients, how you murdered the ones who tried to escape." Victor tried to maintain his defiance. "You can't prove the murders. You have no physical evidence." Blake pulled out a recorder and played Victor's voice from the previous day, the same way we deal with all problems. "They went for boat rides and forgot how to swim. Actually, I have very detailed confessions from both of you. Admissions to murder, trafficking, corruption, everything needed to ensure you never hurt anyone again." Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Iris. All evidence packages delivered to media. Story breaking on every major network. Federal task force being assembled to investigate corruption. "You did it, Blake." Blake showed the message to his prisoners. "My journalist friend has ensured your crimes will be front-page news for months. Every detail of your operation, every victim's story, every corrupt official you bribed, all of it public knowledge. Then why are you keeping us here?" Trinity demanded. "Turn us over to the FBI. Let the system handle us." Blake laughed bitterly. "The system? The same system where Deputy Director Brennan was taking $50,000 a month from your operation? The system where Detective Hutchins fed you information about investigations? The system where ADA Santos made your criminal cases disappear?" Blake walked to a wall display showing organizational charts of their network's corruption. "Even with the evidence I've provided, how many of these officials will actually face meaningful consequences? How many will make deals, claim ignorance, or simply resign quietly?" "That's not our fault," Victor protested. "It's exactly your fault," Blake replied coldly. "You created this network of corruption specifically to protect yourselves from consequences. You made justice impossible through legal channels." Blake pulled out a set of photographs, crime scene images he'd obtained through his intelligence contacts. "These are the burial sites where you disposed of your murder victims. Remote locations where you thought they'd never be found." Trinity's face went white. "How did you?" "I have resources you never imagined," Blake said. "Military contacts, intelligence operatives, private investigators. People who care about justice more than bureaucratic procedures." Blake activated another screen showing GPS coordinates and satellite imagery. 34 graves scattered across 3 states. "The FBI is already conducting recovery operations based on the intelligence I provided." "You're going to turn us in then?" Victor asked hopefully. Blake studied both prisoners for a long moment. "Turn you in to face trial by the same judicial system you corrupted? Watch you hire expensive lawyers and make plea deals with prosecutors you've been bribing for years?" Blake pulled out a military field manual and opened it to a chapter on field justice. "During the war, when we captured enemy operatives who had committed crimes against civilians, we sometimes couldn't rely on local authorities to handle justice properly. The authorities were either corrupt or compromised." "What are you saying?" Trinity whispered. I'm saying that sometimes when the system fails, individuals have to ensure justice is served. Blake walked to a storage cabinet and removed several items: rope, concrete blocks, chains, and a waterproof tarp. During your confessions, you describe how you murdered your victims by taking them on boat rides and making them forget how to swim, drowning in deep water where the bodies would never be recovered. Both prisoners began struggling against their restraints and panic. "Blake, you can't," Trinity screamed. "I'm your wife. You love me." "You're not my wife," Blake replied calmly. "My wife was a fiction created by a monster to provide cover for trafficking operations. The monster is who you really are." Blake began preparing his equipment with military precision. 34 innocent women died because of your actions. 17 more suffered months or years of torture and sexual slavery. Dozens of families were destroyed. "We'll confess everything," Victor shouted. "Full cooperation. We'll testify against everyone." "Your confessions are already recorded," Blake said. "The evidence is already in the hands of investigators. The media has the story. Your testimony isn't needed anymore." Blake attached concrete blocks to chains with practiced efficiency. "The beautiful thing about your chosen method of murder is that it leaves no physical evidence. Bodies lost in deep water, never to be recovered." "Blake, please," Trinity sobbed. "I know I can never make up for what I've done, but please don't do this." Blake looked at his former wife with complete coldness. "Did you show mercy to any of your victims when they begged for their lives?" The silence was answer enough. Blake loaded his equipment into his vehicle, then returned for his prisoners. Time to go for a boat ride. Chapter 8. The Deep Water. Blake drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward Lake Meridian, a deep mountain lake 40 miles from the mining facility. Trinity and Victor sat in the back of his SUV, still restrained, their faces reflecting the terror their victims had once felt. "Blake," Trinity tried one final time, "I know you think I never loved you, but that's not true. Yes, I married you initially for cover, but over time—" "Stop!" Blake's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Every word you speak is another lie. You're incapable of love. You're a predator who learned to mimic human emotions." The lake came into view as the sun began to rise over the mountains. Blake had chosen this location carefully. Deep water, isolated, no witnesses. The same criteria Trinity and Victor had used when disposing of their murder victims. Blake parked at an abandoned boat ramp and began unloading his equipment. A small motorboat was secured to a hidden dock, acquired through his network of military contacts who didn't ask questions about operational requirements. "Please," Victor begged as Blake loaded the concrete blocks into the boat. "I'll do anything. Give you money, information, whatever you want." "I want the 34 women you murdered to be alive," Blake replied. "Can you give me that?" Blake forced his prisoners into the boat at gunpoint, securing them to the seats with professional restraints. The boat engine started smoothly, carrying them toward the lake's deepest point. "During the war," Blake said conversationally as they moved across the water, "I learned that some enemies can't be reformed or rehabilitated. They're too damaged, too committed to evil. The only way to protect innocent people is to eliminate the threat permanently." Trinity was sobbing openly now. "Blake, our marriage meant something." "I know it did. You can't kill your own wife." "You're not my wife," Blake repeated. "You're a stranger who wore my wife's face while committing atrocities. The woman I married never existed." Blake stopped the boat over the lake's deepest point, nearly 200 feet of cold, dark water. According to his research, bodies weighted with concrete blocks would sink to depths where they'd never be recovered. "Any last words?" Blake asked, preparing the chains and weights. "Wait!" Victor shouted desperately. "There's something else. Something you don't know." Blake paused. "What?" "The operation. It's bigger than just trafficking. We were recruiting the women for something else too. Something that would have made us millions." "Elaborate." Victor looked at Trinity, who shook her head frantically. "Don't tell him," she whispered. "Snuff films," Victor said, his voice breaking. "We were making snuff films with some of the women. High-end clients who paid premium prices to watch murders on live video feeds." Blake felt his blood turn to ice. "How many?" 7 so far. The clients paid $500,000 each to watch. Blake stared at these monsters who had exceeded even his worst estimates of their depravity. You filmed murders for entertainment? Blake, don't listen to him, Trinity pleaded. Victor's lying. He's trying to shock you. She planned it, Victor interrupted. The snuff films were Trinity's idea. She said we could make more money from killing them than keeping them alive. Blake looked at Trinity, seeing the truth in her eyes before she could form another lie. The clients, Blake said quietly. I want names. Blake, please. Names. Blake roared, his composure finally cracking. Terrified by his fury, Trinity provided a list that included politicians, celebrities, business leaders, people who paid enormous sums to watch innocent women being murdered for their entertainment. Blake recorded everything, then transmitted the information to Iris with a simple message: additional evidence. Ensure this reaches the task force immediately. Now you know everything, Victor said desperately. That's worth something, right? Information like this. Blake attached the first set of chains and concrete blocks to Victor's restraints. Information like this proves you're even more depraved than I thought. Blake, wait. Trinity screamed. I can help you catch the snuff film clients. I know where the videos are stored, how to access the payment systems. I already have that information from your confessions and computer files, Blake replied. The FBI will find everything they need. Blake lifted Victor to the edge of the boat. The former military police officer tried to struggle, but the restraints and weights made movement impossible. Any of your murder victims who begged for mercy? Blake asked. Victor's face twisted with rage and fear. You're a killer just like us now, Morrison. What does that make you? The difference, Blake said calmly, is that I kill monsters to protect innocent people. You killed innocent people to become monsters. Blake pushed Victor over the side. The weighted chains pulled him under immediately, his final scream cut short by the dark water. Blake turned to Trinity, who was hyperventilating with terror. Blake, please, she whispered. I know I can never earn your forgiveness, but please don't do this. Find some other way. Blake studied the woman who had shared his bed while planning murders for profit. What other way? Life in prison where you'll manipulate guards and other inmates? Escape attempts funded by your hidden assets? Plea bargains that reduce your sentence? Blake attached the chains to Trinity's restraints. You corrupted the justice system specifically to avoid consequences. There is no other way. Blake, I love you, Trinity said desperately. Whatever else I've done, that part was real. Please don't let your last memory of me be like this. Blake looked into Trinity's eyes and spoke with quiet finality. My last memory of you is finding Iris Novak handcuffed to a bed in your operation. Everything before that was a lie. Blake lifted Trinity to the edge of the boat. She wasn't struggling anymore, just staring at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Our wedding vows, she whispered. Till death do us part. You promised. Death has already parted us, Blake replied. You died the moment you chose to become a monster. Blake pushed his former wife into the dark water and watched her disappear beneath the surface. The lake returned to stillness, its depths now holding the final remains of a trafficking network that had destroyed dozens of lives. Blake sat in the boat for several minutes, feeling something settle inside him. Not satisfaction, but a sense of completion. Justice had been served. The innocent were protected. The monsters were gone. Blake started the boat engine and headed back to shore. He had cleanup work to finish and a new life to begin. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 3 months later, Blake Morrison sat in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, reading news coverage of the Federal Task Force's final report on the trafficking network. The investigation had uncovered evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of government, resulting in dozens of arrests and resignations. Deputy Director Charles Brennan faced life in prison for racketeering and conspiracy. Detective Ray Hutchins had been found dead in his jail cell, an apparent suicide. ADA Maria Santos had fled the country and was wanted on international warrants. The snuff film network had been completely exposed, with clients facing charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to financing criminal enterprises. Several high-profile politicians and business leaders had been arrested in coordinated raids. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Iris Novak. Meeting with documentary producers today. They want to tell the complete story of how the network was exposed and the victims were rescued. You sure you don't want to participate? Blake typed back. The victims' stories are what matter. Keep me anonymous. Blake had disappeared from his old life completely. Officially, Blake Morrison had died in a boating accident on Lake Meridian. The same accident that killed Trinity Morrison and Victor Reyes when their boat was found capsized with no survivors. In reality, Blake had used skills learned during his Special Forces years to create a new identity. Thomas Blake was a security consultant based in Portland, with impeccable references and a background that would withstand careful scrutiny. The insurance money from Trinity's death had been donated anonymously to organizations that helped trafficking victims. Blake had no interest in profiting from her crimes. Blake's new apartment was spartanly furnished but comfortable. He'd returned to the simple life he'd known before marriage, finding peace in routine and solitude. The nightmares had stopped after the first month. His phone rang. A potential client needing security consultation for her small business. Blake Security Solutions, this is Tom. Mr. Blake? My name is Sarah Chun. I run a women's shelter downtown, and we've been having some security issues. Break-ins, threatening phone calls. Could you help us? Blake smiled. I'd be happy to help. Where would you like to meet? Blake spent the afternoon at the shelter, assessing security needs and meeting with staff. The women staying there reminded him of the trafficking victims he'd rescued, survivors working to rebuild their lives after experiencing unspeakable trauma. We don't have much budget for security upgrades, Sarah explained apologetically. Don't worry about the cost, Blake replied. Consider this pro bono work. Blake installed a comprehensive security system over the following week, including cameras, alarms, and panic buttons. He also trained the staff in basic security protocols and provided his personal contact information for emergencies. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked as Blake completed the installation. You could make more money working for corporations. Blake looked at the women in the shelter's common area. Mothers with children, young women trying to start over, elderly women who had nowhere else to go. Sometimes protecting innocent people is more important than making money, he said simply. Blake's new life settled into a satisfying routine. Security consultations during the day, volunteer work at the shelter in the evenings, martial arts training to stay sharp. No romantic relationships. He wasn't ready to trust anyone with that level of intimacy again. On the anniversary of Trinity and Victor's deaths, Blake drove to a mountain overlook near Lake Meridian, not to mourn them, but to reflect on the path that had led him here. His phone buzzed with a news alert. The last of the trafficking network's major clients had been sentenced. A former senator who received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder in the snuff film operations. Blake deleted the alert without reading the details. That chapter of his life was closed. As the sun set over the mountains, Blake received a call from Sarah at the shelter. Tom, we have a situation. A woman just arrived with her 2 children. She's been trafficked for 3 years and finally escaped. She's terrified her captors will find her. Blake was already walking toward his vehicle. I'll be right there,